Well, when Beth asked me to do this, I said to Angie, I don't know, I don't have anything in particular I want to say. And then the last couple of days, Angie and I just talked and realized there are lots of stories of our coming here and our being here. And there are stories that we tell our friends or tell each other all the time. And so those just started to kind of roll out. I came here after I had been 15 years as a pastor in Spartanburg at an old historic church, really a church very much like Salem Black River. And I'd come from there to Columbia, to Eastminster, where I was one of the senior associate pastors there, and really focusing on two things, education and mission. And that's what I was doing. I'd been doing that a couple of years when the committee from First Presbyterian came. Now, I'd known a pretty good bit about First Presbyterian because I had, through the years, become friends with Ed McLeod when he was in Greer. And just being in ministry in South Carolina, I had developed a friendship with Bill Holmes, and who's in Manning. I had gotten to know Peggy Swan in Foothills Presbytery. And so I knew some folks. I had met numerous people who'd grown up in Sumter and ended up in other parts of the state. In particular, I was involved off and on during my times at Nazareth at Converse College and teaching at Wofford College some. At Converse, I had run into a pretty young undergraduate there named Margaret Hunter. And she had been the head of the campus Christian fellowship there, and I'd gotten to know her and thought she was one of the loveliest people I'd ever met. So it was a wonderful thing. A few years later, I was teaching at Fourth Presbyterian in Greenville. The young man walked up and introduced himself to me as Sam Hunter, and that was young Sam. And he and I got to know each other and became friends through his living in Greenville, and just over the years, he and I developed a friendship. So I had connections, or I at least knew about First Presbyterian and Sumter a little bit when we came. Ed and I had played golf very regularly. I had been down here, and Bill Holmes had told me that his son, his oldest son Will, and wife Summer were moving over here. He was very interested in, of course, them becoming members at First Presbyterian, and so all of that was kind of in the offing when we came here. I had preached a couple of times supplying for Ed. I did, and that's when Angie and I were introduced to this beautiful sanctuary, and we still think it's the most beautiful sanctuary we have ever worshiped in. We love being here. I will tell you it's a sheer pleasure, and it always is and has been a pleasure to preach from the First Presbyterian pulpit. I've always enjoyed that very much. So I knew about it. The committee came and talked to me when they first came. We had just moved to Eastminster, and we felt like, well, no, this really isn't good timing for us to think about coming to another place. The committee came back about a year later. Fred Brogdon was a wonderful another introduction to the Sumter community and the spirit that's here. And so anyway, that felt like very much more something important for us to do. And so I accepted the call to come here. We've talked numerous times, Angie and I, about it was such a quick immersion in the community of Sumter when we got here. We got to know and enjoyed the fact of how First Presbyterian was so interconnected with the whole life of the city. I always have enjoyed that so much. Very connected to New Harmony Presbytery. And I enjoyed all of my time here being very involved with the Committee on Ministry of the New Harmony Presbytery. And of course, there are names that come up all the time as people who went out of their way to help us get connected to the Sumter community. I will never forget, because he became such a wonderful friend and also had connections with the Eastminster family. Pap Probst, Pap and Helen were both such gracious hosts and hostesses to us. Opened their home to us numerous times. And Pap went out of his way to take me to the weekly Rotary meetings, to introduce me to the Rotary, the downtown Rotary of Sumter. Whatever you call that, he sponsored me to be a member of that Rotary, and that was a very important factor in me meeting local leaders of the Sumter community, and I'll always be grateful for that. At a very personal level, Our oldest son, Sam, was a junior and then a senior at the University of South Carolina, and he was majoring in chemistry, intending to go into medical school. And when Pap discovered that, Pap went out of his way to say to Sam, if you want to talk about the whole medical school process and what it is from here to where you're, in your classes to how you go about applying and encouraging Sam to apply to the medical school. He was on the board at the medical school in Columbia. And in fact, Pap invited us, Sam and me, over several evenings just to talk to us and really just to kind of demystify the whole process. Of course, Sam still had to get the best possible grades. He still had to score high on tests. He still had to, do well in interviews and things. But Pap was so gracious in helping him understand, Sam, this is the kind of person that we are looking for. This is the kind of doctor that we are hoping to train and to help along their way at the medical school. And so I think it helped Sam to just, he was thinking about aspiring to be up among the angels, and that helped him so much just to realize, okay, these are the things I can work on and that I can do. And it was wonderful for Sam. It was such a gift when Sam was accepted to the medical school, and when he began, you get your white coat and everybody officially starts calling you doctor. And Pap, who was of course retired as a much beloved pediatrician of Sumter, along with Ted Young, Pap gave to Sam a wonderful gift of a little plaque that had stitched on it the Hippocratic Oath, of course, the doctor's oath of service. And Pap had it on his wall all during his career as a pediatrician. He gave it to Sam for Sam to hang on his wall, and that was a very great kind of personal gift and just such a wonderful thing. Names of among us that come up all the time, Chuck and Sue Feening were so helpful to us. Sue and Angie formed a singing group with a couple of other women and had a wonderful time singing around Sumter. Ken Young, Jeff Young were wonderfully supportive and helpful to us. Sibby McFadden was great too and has continued, just was a wonderful supporter of ours. We loved Lee Craig. Lee was very involved, but not only here, but at the Presbytery level, and we always enjoyed that so much. Some of the stories, I'll tell you that funny things that introduced us to just what Sumter was about. One of the first things, Angie's convinced it was the first wedding that I did here in Sumter. It was at the home of Cricket and Randa Edmonds, and there at the side they had a small wedding for their daughter Hayes and John Jones, and we did the wedding there, and then they invited all their friends to come to a reception in the big front yard of their family home. And so the family was there. It was a warm summer evening, and we were all standing outside. I think that was our introduction to mint juleps, maybe. And we were standing around, and whoa, look there. There is Jenny McLeod and daughter Amy, and they have been so friendly with this family. They've come all the way from Raleigh, where Ed had moved, and where they had moved in, and so they were here just to enjoy the wedding with us. So we were chatting with Jenny, and Jenny said, one of the first things that she said was, she jokingly said to me, well, Mark, you may not know this yet, but with this wedding today, this makes it official. Now every single person in Sumter is officially and legally related to one another. And we laughed at the joke, and it became greater over the years. We've enjoyed it so much. A short time later, here from the pulpit, I told the story of my mother, who, when she became a widow after several years, she married my father's brother, who had also been twice widowed before that. And so the two of them said, my mom had said to me, well, at my age, how do you meet people? I have known him all your life, and she said to me, he is the one of your dad's brothers that I could stand to be around. And so anyway, they had gotten married, and it was a funny little thing I had carried with me from Spartanburg down through Columbia, and I told that story during a sermon here one Sunday. And At the back door, greeting people after worship that Sunday, Elder Henry McFadden came out. He shook my hand and he said, Mark, so if I understand you right, you're saying that your mom is now your aunt and now your uncle is your daddy. He said, Mark, welcome to Sumter County. And I always enjoyed that so much. I felt like that was just a wonderful human touch here, and I appreciated Henry. And we've told that story and that quip numerous times over. It's a weird thing to say how I've arranged these things. I will say to you, first of all, I want to tell you, I think everybody knows that Angie and I were very involved in the choir here. It is something that I did at my much smaller church in Spartanburg to sing in the choir. At that time, at the way that church was set up, I could preach and sit in the chair behind the pulpit and just walk over 3 steps and be in the choir. So I had done that in our smaller church at Nazareth, but enjoyed it so much and enjoyed the friendship of the choir director there and the choir. And so when we had gone to Columbia, Angie had sung in the very high-powered Eastminster choir, and I had kind of dipped in and out for special times, had sung with that choir. So anyway, when we came here, we met Laura Ballard, Laura and Tripp and their family, and got to know them. And we will say that Laura made us feel so welcome here. We have never felt more welcomed into a choir than we did here at First Presbyterian. Everything about it we enjoyed, and it became really a family experience for us. We loved singing in this choir just from Laura's special talents and her truly ministerial gifts. She increased the size of the choir really just by her caring and her love as a director of the choir. She worked so well with Hamilton. Angie and I have always loved, we tell stories of Hamilton Stoddard and how appropriate and wonderfully an accompanist she is, and how we love to be in a worship service when anytime that Hamilton is playing. Hamilton and her husband became good friends of us, and we appreciated that very much. But Laura and Tripp made the choir into such a fellowship. We went out for supper every Wednesday night with a few of the choir members, whoever could go. It was just a kind of self-selected group. It grew to be maybe 10 or 12 of us every Sunday. And we decided we would only eat in local non-chain Sumter restaurants, and we had about 5 or 6 around town that we would go to every week. And we loved doing that. Ted and Debbie Williams' son Todd became the special arranger. He would call the restaurant and let them know that we were bringing a mob in for a little later supper each Wednesday night, and that was a wonderfully fun thing. We made best and truly lifelong friends out of the choir, and those friendships endure, and we're so grateful to God for that to this day. When Laura put on, and as her special treat, she wanted to put on with son John Amal and the Night Visitors, and we performed that down at the Sumter Opera House. That was a glorious experience for us. We loved every bit of that production. I played one of the 3 kings, kind of the kooky one who was in love with his collection of glass beads. And Angie and I enjoyed always being here in the productions of the Sumter Little Theater. We especially enjoyed and enjoy in memory now going to see David Brown and his tour de force performance in The Death of a Salesman. That was a special treat for us. And just to be involved with the Sumter Little Theater, we enjoyed that. Angie and I had small roles in The Music Man, and that was a wonderful time to be here in Sumter. One thing that brings us back to Sumter every year with the death of our son Burke is that Angie worked with the folks in the administration at Central Carolina Technical College and set up a yearly award to the top student in law enforcement studies. And so we come back every year on the awards night for Central Carolina, and it's always held in the Opera House, at least has been so far, and it's a wonderful time for us to reconnect, and especially to see young people who are coming up and giving themselves and intending to give their lives in that wonderful field of public service. We're thrilled to be a part of that, and it helps us. It keeps us coming back to Sumter. I want to say to you that, as I said, this may sound weird. I always took a special joy, and I have felt like it's just a part of my ministry that developed from Spartanburg to Columbia to here. I always took a special joy in performing funeral services, memorial services here at First Presbyterian. It has been my practice upon the death of a loved one to visit with the family and to ask the family and the loved ones who are gathered around to just tell me the story of the life of this person who's been, as Mayor Bubba used to say, now promoted to glory. I love that phrase. And Angie and I tell the story numerous times of one particularly sweltering day in Sumter. We were down at the mausoleum in the Evergreen Cemetery. It was at least 105 degrees there in the mausoleum as the service started, and everybody was taking up positions. Everybody was mopping their brow. Everybody was trying. They set up chairs from the funeral home, those plastic white chairs, and people were trying to find a place where they could sort of stand while the service went on. I had, beforehand, I'd known that I was going to feel some distress, and so I'd gotten a Tupperware cup full of ice and water and had given it to Angie and said in the middle of the service, I'm probably going to have to call for this if I can't take it anymore. And so one moment during the service, Angie loves to tell people, and so in the middle of the service, the preacher stopped and said, I need my wife to bring me a drink right this minute. And so Angie got out of her chair and came down the side, and all during this time, people were passing out. There were at least, say, 5 people, maybe 3 of them at least, maybe 4 that were members of the First Presbyterian community at this service that were just, everybody thinking, okay, I'll be okay. I can just lean against this. They were gone. And so people were helping to lay each people out while we continued the service. Angie brought me the ice water. She went back. She had recently just had her hip replacement surgery, had a pin placed in her hip from a fall that she had suffered. And so she went back to her chair. She very gingerly sat back in the plastic funeral home chair, and it went right down and splatted on the ground. And she popped up like a second. And I think I made a comment about to appreciate my wife for bringing the entertainment for the afternoon, but really the folks falling out were pretty much the entertainment all by themselves. But of course, that was just typical of life in Sumter, and especially of an outdoor or even under a tent, a funeral service. But we remember funeral services, a Moe's funeral that was right here in the sanctuary, and Moe's son got up, and his mom's casket was sitting here, and he got up and he had asked me, he said, now I wanted to talk about my mom, and I said, well, sure. And so I sat down after reading the opening things, and he got up and he stood behind the pulpit and he said, I would like to ask for a moment of silence. And he paused for 30, 45 seconds, and then he looked up, and then he said, there. Now, if you knew my mother, you know that those are the only moments you have ever been in her presence for more than 30 seconds without her having something to say. And we all laughed, but it was such a wonderful thing. His mother was a wonderful conversationalist, a delightful person, and a glorious spirit. It was just a wonderful way to celebrate what a cheerful soul she was, and it just set a tone that was so wonderful. I will tell you that one thing we remember all the time, especially, is the funeral of Burke Watson. That was not only wonderful for us and gloriously done here in the First Presbyterian Sanctuary, but it meant so much to us and was highly educational for Angie. Burke, as you know, was a proud Citadel graduate. He was the Southern Conference boxing champion, and all during his business career, he mentored young men by teaching them about boxing and teaching them how to live and be gentlemen and to be contribute to their community, taking really some very rough characters and turning them into young men suitable for being a positive member in the community. Burke, of course, had an insurance company, and he had, all during his years in his company, he had worked through the years, saved money to endow 3 scholarships in perpetuity, full scholarships for students to attend the Citadel. And at his service, we had just learned from this. We didn't know it before this. We'd learned it from his family. This was mentioned, and it was announced that the first recipient of that full scholarship was here with us in the sanctuary. Angie's pointing to the very spot where he stood. When we looked up, we looked to see this young, strapping, beautifully outfitted young black man in full Citadel regalia. And we were just stunned and bowled over, and the whole congregation just burst into applause. Well, I say educational because not only was that so inspiring, but Angie learned from that and thought to herself, well, you mean you could take out an insurance policy, especially while you're still young and fit, and that policy could grow so wonderfully that it could result in enormous gifts to people at the time of your passing. Of course, every insurance person knows this, but this was something that came to life in front of us in such a vivid way, and Angie has taken that to heart and has determined that she's going to be a great benefactor of folks at her passing, which will be sometime in the next 75 years. So look for that. One of the things that we have always remarked on is the way that the church rallied around families especially. We were a family who went through the death of a young son, but there were 2 others in particular that we will never forget: the death of John Brabham and the death of Henry Feening. And just the way that the First Presbyterian Church reached its arms around the families, the grieving families of this church. I will never forget the sanctuary being so filled to overflowing at the death of Henry Feening and Chuck, who is just the epitome of stateliness and Presbyterian elderly, not old, elder-ish propriety. Chuck coming out with the family and doing something I wasn't able to do it when we were the grieving family, but I remember Chuck coming and standing in the front of the sanctuary, and when the family usually sits down and just feels the weight of the the gathered congregation's eyes upon them, Chuck first came and stood in the pew, and he turned around, and he looked at every single face of every person who had gathered there to be a source of support and love for him and his family on that day. And I personally will never forget that moment. And it speaks to me. Of course, when we came here, Angie was taking care of her mother, of her grandmother, Inez Rudd, in our home. And it's particularly Angie's unique gifts and strength that she was able to do that and nursed Inez to her dying day. And her mother, Erlene Burke, also then was afflicted with Alzheimer's. And the 2 of them ended at Covenant Place in the very same room, though they did not know each other, and they died within days of each other. Again, we just say we will always be grateful to the congregation here at First Presbyterian for the support and being so good and surrounding us with love and care at those most important moments of transition and life. A few more things and people I want to mention to you. Bubba McElveen was such a character in this city. It's a glorious factor of First Sumter's life to have the presence of so many mayors, Mayor Joe here and Mayor Steve here in this congregation week by week, and I've appreciated all of them. But Mayor Bubba had a special particular little moments of ministry in our lives. Well, Angie and I were just getting to know, we'd been here a little over a couple of years and getting to know Sumter life. Angie and I were eating at the little Mexican restaurant and in the front window on Main Street. It's the restaurant that now has been transformed into the New Hamptons. But we were sitting in the window. Mayor Bubba walked by and he saw us sitting in there, and he stopped and he came in and he pulled up a chair and he sat there. And as we were looking out the window at passing Main Street traffic, he looked down and he said, "Now, do you know anything about that window right over there, that building across the street from us, and about this building that we're in right here?" And he told us stories then about what these buildings had been, about what they had been in a previous facade, in a previous construction. And he began to look down the street, and he pointed from one end of Main Street to the other, and he told us the story of every single building all across Main Street. It was the most spectacular tour de force of introduction to Sumter history and what Sumter had been before, about hotels that had been in the town, and sites that you would have seen 100 years ago here, and it was just such a beautiful thing for us. I began reading his lovely little weekly newsletter before I came to Sumter, and it was a wonderful introduction to me. And I'll never forget him saying week by week about another blessed saint who had been promoted to glory. I can never think about the move that all of us are going to make in the years to come, and without thinking of that wonderful phrase about our promotion to glory. And of course, in the promise of the Lord, we know that's exactly what it is. I do want to say, in that way, we enjoyed getting to know Sammy Way, the coach and high school teacher who was, in fact, one of Sumter's great historians. And we, through USC Sumter, went on several bus tours with him of Sumter City and of Sumter County, and just to hear Sammy tell about all the stories as we passed fields and places and plantations and former this and that was just one of the great experiences for us. And of course, here in the First Presbyterian congregation was Catherine Richardson, who was willing and so generous to give us in the First Sumter crowd a glorious tour of that King's Highway 527, stretching down from Kingstree and beyond down, and all of the churches that are on that highway up through Salem Black River. We spent a wonderful Saturday on a bus tour of our own and learning about the history of the U.S. involved in the history that's right here among us in South Carolina. And I cannot say how grateful I am to Catherine and the gifts that she gave to us with her knowledge and her special attention that she has devoted herself to the history of Sumter. Angie and I, through involvement with getting to know the folks at Salem Black River, got to know also the folks at Goodwill Presbyterian Church. And we served for a while, for a year or so, on their board as they were reconstructing the original school that had been there beside the Goodwill congregation. And that was a wonderful experience for us, the people that we met in the Goodwill congregation, going to suppers with them and just spending time with them. And we will never forget the involvement that we've had. It has been our pleasure to come back to occasional services at Salem Black River, and we have enjoyed that, knowing their connection with the Reverend Bill Holmes in Manning for almost 30 plus years has been a wonderful time for us as well. I'll just mention a few other things. First of all, mission trips. I had a wonderful set of experiences going on mission trips to Reynosa, Mexico, with folks from Sumter. But one of the best times that we had was going to the work that was being done in Iquitos, Peru, in the churches of started around the city of Iquitos, Peru. Iquitos, we discovered and learned through our previous involvement in Eastminster, Iquitos is the largest city in the world that cannot be reached either by road, by highway, or by it can only be reached by air or by water. You have to come up the Amazon River through Brazil into Peru, or you have to fly in, which of course is the way that we got there. And we'd been to Iquitos a couple of times before this, but the trip that we'll never forget to remember is the trip that Gus Bloom signed on for. And Gus, growing up in his Argentinian family, Gus is not only a big, wonderful portrayer in the Goliath stories, if you'll ask him to do it, but at least he was down there. We went on and put on, essentially, a vacation Bible school for the maybe 50 children of this small community out on the outskirts of Iquitos. And when we decided that's what we were going to do for the week, Gus was just such a glorious ambassador. Everything that Angie and I, telling the Bible stories and trying to illustrate them for the children, Gus was willing to be virtually every biblical personage in the whole history of the biblical story. And Gus, just because he was absolutely fluent and mellifluously fluent in Spanish, was able to relate to the children in ways that we could only look back and admire on. We just sat back and watched Gus go, and I hope that he will always say that was one of his favorite weeks. There's no question that it was one of our favorite weeks of all of our involvement in church life, I think.